just a little second and say something. Yeah,
yep,
fine.
that's okay. 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 Thank you, everybody. I'm going to put my camera on as well. Thank you ever so much to Trevor for that brilliant outdoor demonstration, streaming live online. Only Trevor could do that for us, so that was brilliant. Thanks so much. So we're going to move on to session 6, which is going to be focusing on EDI issues as well as sustainability. Our first talk is going to be No Fieldwork from Sonja Rewhorn at the Open University. Thank you, Sonja. Thanks, Alice. Thanks, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Yes, as Alice said, I'm Sonja Rewhorn and I'm from Geography and Environmental Studies here at the Open University. Different to our earlier speaker, Jenny, who's in a different school. I'm in the School of Social Sciences and Global Studies. So I'm just going to sort of share with you this morning sort of a way that we at the Open University sort of address inclusivity, from perhaps taking it the next stage to what we heard a lot about yesterday, when we were sort of reflecting on a lot of the excellent lessons and innovations that we all adapted at the beginning of the pandemic, and how much is being continued, particularly around inclusivity. But of course, here at the Open University, we were already online, and that's not to say we knew what we were doing. It was just that was our starting point. But that means that we're at a different stage in terms of being inclusive. So because we've got that distance education pedagogy, we also have to think about inclusivity, and it's not just the excellent work that we're doing now in the sector around inclusivity, using the virtual field to sort of enable those with family commitments or disabilities or whatever to sort of be part of that. But actually, as I said, we were already there. So what this talk is that sort of another step into that inclusivity dimension of the virtual fieldwork for those students that actually can't leave their home or can't use the digital platform. So that might be because of an additional need, or it might be because of where they live and the lack of digital connectivity. I mean, it is improving. Trevor's mentioned that a couple of times over the last couple of days, but it's not perfect. And of course, for those students who actually are in secure environments, our prison students. So I'm going to just share with you 2 examples from 2 modules that, if you like, I've not inherited, but I've sort of gained as part of my role here at the Open University. So this is just sort of our approach. It is not necessarily sort of the standard approach. So, for example, you'll see examples of what we have seen over the last couple of days around
sort of story maps, videos, photographs, so that asynchronous stand. So a lot of it will look familiar, as particularly sort of from the last couple of years from your own work. In our particular school at the moment, we don't do the live labcasts that I know that Sarah does, but it's just to give you an example of what we do. You know, at the end of the day, we aren't dissimilar to sort of some of the work that Helen was talking about at the sort of first discussion we had yesterday morning. It's around building the students' capabilities around specific skills, and we focus them around fieldwork skills, albeit in our context of asynchronous and virtual. So what I'm going to hopefully do is show what we offer, or what our students will see. There we go. Have you got that? Excellent. So as I say, this isn't dissimilar to what you might see with like story maps, and students will do various clicks that will take them, in this case, to a part of Greece, looking at an ancient site, and the sort of part of this particular element of the fieldwork of this particular module is that sort of cultural entanglements around what should happen to that heritage site. Should it be protected? Should it be not protected? What should happen? The management of it. So like I say, this isn't, you know, we've got sort of, I suppose, geospacing, we've got story maps, and then we end up, hopefully, excellent, with some photos where we can, there's the 3D. So going back to yesterday, there was the sustainable, you know, carbon footprint for some of the team to go out and do all of this, but it wasn't the students. So this was done in advance of the students. So this is kind of what we would see, and there's descriptions and other photos. Oh, Catherine, get my presentation back. Sorry, that was poor Teams there. But of course, for us within our particular school, we don't, that's the one. We don't have a secure website for our prison students. Some departments do, we don't. So what our students would see, for those that are in prisons, or those, like I say, that can't use digital materials or don't have that connectivity, are screenshots. So literally those sort of step by step I took you through, they would have a screenshot. So they have a pack, they have a printed pack, old-fashioned printed pack of those step-by-step screenshots. They still have the same information, they still have the same pictures, they still have the same words. What they don't get is the tech, but they still are included. So they have that inclusivity, which I suppose where we're sort of moving from, and we talked about it a lot yesterday, is we're not having that alternative. You know, we were talking about that in the past, that people who couldn't go on Fieldwork were given an essay instead. And I know we've moved on from that, but obviously for our students, they are seeing exactly the same with screenshots. And then they move on to sort of an active learning website. So all of our work goes through sort of that asynchronous website where they will have various activities. I mean, I've put up a couple up here. They have various questions, because they also have transcripts or videos, again, similar to we saw, of interviews with various stakeholders in the area, and then they're asked questions. And then they go on to our forums. So that sort of conversation, that sort of dialogue that you might lose, that you might feel you might lose from a sort of virtual way. We do use our forums, and unfortunately for this particular example, we have a very, you know, the forum is quite active. And you know, I was looking in preparation for this, and you know, students were writing 500, 600, 700 words to the answer. The questions was like, what were the different interviews saying about the management of the site? So just one said, interview 3 with Nikki, one of the interviewees, explained, similar to Amanta, that the ruins should remain undisturbed, but the surrounding area should be allowed to modernise. She says the tourists come to view the site and leave as there is nothing else in the area. And over the winter, the tourism dwindles in the village, so it's quiet and boring. But as a tour guide, these limited visits means that I only have income at a certain time of the year. So having more things to do around the year to entice people to stay longer would increase her business opportunities. So the students are sort of going into quite a lot of depth, and then that's just one extract. That was from quite a much larger one. So in terms of those that can't access the virtual environment, that might come through. It might be when they can, if they've got limited digital access, they might do it when there isn't so much pressure on the broadband. And if they're prison students, they will have conversations, all being well, by telephone with their tutors, and they would have that same dialogue. So still having that inclusive conversation that we sometimes were discussing yesterday that they might lose. It's not hands-on in the field like we've just had outside, but it's kind of still giving them the opportunity to develop the skills. So moving on to the second example, which is a different module. I mean, both of the modules are sort of developing the analysing, applying, evaluating skills, but they're just doing it in that sort of more asynchronous environment. So what you've got here is just some screenshots of a video around Milton Keynes for those that might sort of recognise it. This is one that was filmed in the pandemic, so Milton Keynes was a popular choice for obvious reasons. So they're explaining places, they're situating places. The person doing the video is talking about the graffiti, talking about the use of the space with young people, whether it's a dead space or not. So they're still getting that. And what the students might do in this one, and you might go, oh, no fieldwork, but the students have done something. They can go out and they can do their own here for, you know, like if it's kind of collecting active data, perhaps photographs or behind Milton Keynes module, they look at so the students would go onto their own and go their own location for their sensitive data because they might not have chosen Milton Keynes as their site, but those that are in slide is just saying that kind of that's still developing those capability skills around applying, evaluating, analysing, and those are those capabilities that Helen mentioned yesterday to take them into the future, whether that's sort of employability or into a dissertation module where they will also sort of be able to apply these skills in their own context. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Online again. Great, thank you very much, Sonja. We'll hold questions to the end of the session if that's okay. Could you just confirm you can hear us all right online?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. And is this Vicky just joined us?
Yes, it is. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. So we'll hear from Vicky Johnson, again at the Open University, talking about COVID-19 and the missed pre-university fieldwork opportunities for our next generation of geographers. Thank you, Vicky.
Thanks. And I should start by saying it's quite... Can you hear me
Sorry,
okay?
could you just take control of the slides and then you should be good to go online.
Let me just...
Someone's got their hand raised. Can you see to do that, Vicky? At the top, there should be a little button. Control.
Yes.
While we're doing that, sorry, Becky, your hand's raised. Is there something, Becky, you wanted to raise? Not sure. Okay. If we could have questions in the chat, that would be brilliant. Thank you, Vicky. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm going to start by saying it's quite ironic that I'm talking about COVID, as unfortunately I was struck down by COVID this week, which is why sadly I've missed out being with you all week, and I'm sat in my home office. So the irony was quite great in my mind in terms of how that happened. Anyway, thanks for the opportunity for presenting today, and also thanks for flicking me to online since I can't be there in person. Like Sonja, I'm based in geography in the School of Social Science and Global Studies in the Open University, and actually what I'm looking at really came as a result of some of the presentations in last year's conference, which were really interesting and actually really helped me think about, oh, look at everything that's taking place in higher education, like we were doing with the OU, but also it gave me that opportunity to think, actually, what about those who are impacted pre-higher education? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So, like I say, it's been really interesting listening to the last day and a half, because there's lots of things I've picked up on and that I'll take forward kind of later on, because it is really interesting what you've been focusing on and some of the conversations. So what I really wanted to explore was actually what happened to those students pre-reaching higher education. They're in a really different position, those who've been through the COVID element, and particularly because we've got a new degree in geography that's begun, and what I wanted to do is to start looking at actually what the impact has been. The OU has a reputation for mature and not A-level completers, but our experience is that we do have quite a range of younger students now who will have been experienced. So over the next few years, looking at that cohort moving through is going to be really interesting. So this is really the starting point that I'm going to talk to you about. I think it's just really as well just to think about those who study who've studied A-level or GCSE geography have actually completed prior to their geography degrees a project or fieldwork based around cycles of inquiry. And until COVID-19, this was seen as really very, very much outside the classroom and actually outside the school grounds. So kind of thinking back to yesterday in the university allotment, that wouldn't have been allowed because that's in the school grounds. The exam boards are very much, it's got to be outside the school grounds. And that the fieldwork activities need to cover quantum qual skills and also physical and human geography. So they really will have experienced, if they've come up through the A-level route, that opportunity for real world fieldwork before they hit the university, as it were. So just to start with a little bit of a reminder about what fieldwork looked like for both GCSE and A-level students pre-COVID. So this is what's potentially, these are the students who are potentially coming through to us who've got that spark in geography initiated at school. So GCSEs now covered over 2 or 3 years, so years 9, 10 and 11, or 3rd, 4th and 5th form in old money, as it were. And fieldwork is required, but not necessarily as an examinable element. So they don't necessarily, or I should say as an examinable element, but not necessarily as a fieldwork project. They need to complete the fieldwork and they need to look at contrasting environments and go out for at least 2 days and it will be signed by the school, but they don't have to complete their own specific individual fieldwork project. So that's kind of where we are with that. What it does mean that actually when it came to COVID, they are assessed through the exam rather than having that field work element. For A-level students, they're in a slightly different position because not only are they assessed on their fieldwork skills through the exam, but they also carry out a fieldwork project, an independent investigation where they can do some collaborative work, such as through the Field Studies Council centres that we heard about earlier. So there can be collaborative elements, but actually there also has to be quite a lot of independent work. And for all the A-level specs, that's worth about 20% of their exams, looking at about 3,000 to 4,000 words. And just as a reflect, I should say I'm also a senior examiner for one of the exam boards. It's quite interesting looking at where that field work takes place and thinking about the sustainability of it. For many state schools, almost all, the fieldwork takes place relatively local, such as in the UK. They may be lucky and travel to a field study centre and cover coastal work if they're not located in a coastal area. But actually, the independent and fee-paying schools tend to select different options for their students to study. So they often are looking at arid environments or they're looking at glacial environments. So their field work actually takes place in a far less sustainable way because they often travel abroad, either to Morocco or the States for the arid specs, or for Iceland or Switzerland for the glacial. So it's quite interesting that actually our state schools are not 100% sustainable because there is still a carbon emission, obviously, from travelling to coastal areas if you're a student who doesn't live in a coastal area. but far less than the fee-paying contingent. So it's just quite interesting thinking about the sustainability there. So during COVID, there was a whole range of headlines, and I have to declare that these are all from the Times Ed. They're not from mainstream, as it were, so very much school focused, teachers focused newspapers. Obviously, there was a real concern about geography, the threat of geography fieldwork, which happened, and it did happen. It was removed at various points, but there was a real threat. Whilst these are from the Times, yes, actually the conversations on social media reflected the same kind of notion. There's real concern that field work was being cut and the need to save it. And more recently, the conversation has moved actually to the new geography teachers' lack of potential confidence because they've completed their NQT stage without having real life field work taking place in many cases. So there are a range of challenges. So a bit of a timeline here just to show you remind us what happened, because actually it's quite easy when you're sat back to forget exactly how significant the impact specifically on fieldwork as well as education more widely was. So in March, obviously we entered the lockdowns and the schools closed, and very quickly after that there was a cancellation of all the field trips that were going to take place. Moving from March to September, obviously there were no exams, and actually no field work took place because of that nature, and there was really a lack of schooling in terms of that field work element for many students, because the focus was just so complex at that time in terms of all schools moving online. From September 2020 right through to December, actually they were back to school, but it was quite a different setup. There were bubbles, so again it wasn't really an opportunity for field work to take place. There was also a great deal of uncertainty. It wasn't really clear what was going to happen. Was field work going to be assessed? So was it important to cover on focusing? And there was also a lot of self-isolation happening, so a lot of missed opportunities where children missed various bits of their education, very unequal, if you like, in terms of who missed what. And then moving forward, we obviously moved out of the further full lockdown. Again, huge uncertainty over what was happening in terms of exams and education, and moving on to the cancellation in March of exams for that year again. And actually at that point, teachers here may agree, a lot of schools went into a huge amount of testing purely because they didn't know how they were going to deal with that second year of GCSE and A level, and they wanted to make sure, following the criticisms of the first year, not of the schools, of the approach that was taken. So there was a real focus on making sure they'd got the data to ensure children were rewarded with the right grade. So actually it was quite a challenging time. So again, fieldwork was really a long way off the radar for the vast majority of schools. Obviously we then changed, but again, actually getting back to things, there's a lot of catching up being done, and I know teachers are working really hard, but also the challenge of actually what field work's going to be included and what was going to be included in the exam season that's just gone for 22, because again fieldwork was assessed through exams. Did they need to cover it? If they hadn't covered it, how were they going to deal with it? Obviously we're now in effect returned to normal, as she says, sat here with COVID. Okay, so it's a really complicated slide. You don't need to look at it all. What I've been doing is looking at actually what the impact is on students across the time period. And what I would say is I've only started at the secondary school level. I haven't gone back to primary, but we can see, and I'll show you on the next slide, which really kind of I've highlighted it in colours. We've had a huge ramification across all years. So it's not just about those who sat at the time, it's actually all the way across. So here I've just flagged that for the years where we've got this huge impact in terms of, oops, sorry, I've done the wrong way, in terms of those two initial years where we lost a lot of the fieldwork opportunities, and the really important ones for those in year 7 and year 8 who potentially missed all those summer terms worth of fieldwork, which were really important, are really important for students to get their understanding and their knowledge. We obviously had a change in exam system for 21-22, which reduced and took fieldwork questions out of many of the exams, so the school didn't really need to have covered it. And moving on, we suddenly then now return to full curriculum, as it were, and full spec, meaning that there's a lot of catching up in schools to do. So just quickly, a few lessons. Obviously, the examinable component in GCSEs meant that fieldwork could be quite easily removed from what was needed. A level, it wasn't quite as simple, and actually the diversity between how schools approached the NEA, that's an unexaminable component where students actually needed to, some students really in some schools really did put a lot of effort and time in and did complete all the fieldwork and get students really there. Others simply just didn't complete it for those missing years. So we've got a real mixture of students coming forward post A level, because some really have had all the support. And again, it does tend to vary depending on both your school and your home background in terms of what experience they had. But actually, another thing that's come out in some of the training subsequent to COVID is really the focus on primary data. And when we're thinking about fieldwork, we obviously think about both primary and secondary data as really important. Whereas there's a real focus with some of the exam boards on making sure that that primary data is there, and actually what we classify as primary and secondary data. So again, just thinking about that is something that it's going to be really important looking forward, because actually we know that secondary data is also really important, particularly in human, but also in physical geography as well. And just one final thing, I won't finish the slide. We've got a real focus actually now on home as well, which has been quite interested in some of the GA reports, but thinking about actually how we can just really quickly think about curriculum making in geography focusing on home, which isn't necessarily outside the classroom, but again gives that other opportunity. Now, I'm aware that I've probably run over my time. Look at the smiles, so I will just say thank you very much. I can't hear you in the room.
Thank you, Trevor. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you ever so much for that. There's some questions in the chat. We'll collate those. Julia will ask them at the end of the session. We've got one final talk. Brian and Trevor are going to talk about apps for accessibility. I shall pass across to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, do you want to? Yeah, great. Do you want to? Barnabas, thank you. Whoops.
Right. Those of you that attended the very first EFL meeting many moons ago will perhaps remember that I used to get off my motorbike and then bring in one of the panniers into the sessions. I think that was the first case when we had it down in South Wales. And that became known as Brian's box, which we actually haven't used as a pretext or context for doing very much recently. But one thing that I'd like to highlight is the utility of iPads. When COVID came and educational bodies said, oh yeah, we'll distribute iPads or tablets and laptops, I think most people went for laptops. The iPad, however, dates from 2010, I think spring 2010. And when we first put the EFL project forward, we were expecting to use small, almost disposable computers. And then the iPad came out. And I remember getting one, actually I was in San Francisco soon after it came out, and using that facility to call my wife in Sheffield, using that from the Apple shop. But the facilities on the early iPads were really not very good in terms of the connectivity and the utility that you can now do with them. Now, Eddie mentioned yesterday using devices like an iPad in the field as an electronic notebook, and that was one of the ways that I went down. I remember, in fact, in Svalbard too, talking to students, saying this is what you can actually do with them. They're actually much more useful in many respects than a piece of paper and pencil. But as I said, it doesn't necessarily replace that. You can do certain things. For instance, make copies of your field notes and make sure that that's preserved from that point of view. It happens to be a field sketch, but you can use things like taking a photograph, annotating it using an app such as Sketch, and then putting that into a report or using it to back up your field notes. And since then, we've got things like Apple Pencil and a decent Bluetooth, and of course Bluetooth and Wi-Fi connectivity have come along by leaps and bounds since the early days, so that if you want to do some typing on that, you don't have to peck on your keyboard. You can actually use a decent one, which is not too expensive. There are of course much smaller ones, Logitech ones, available if you wish. And the connectivity itself, okay, originally it wasn't easy to link it into the system, but a little two-way Lightning and USB, that's I think 32 gig on that. You know, it's not bad. So you can actually use that for transferring, as I did in this particular case, from composing it on a computer at home, maybe through this, or indeed even using HDMI, plunking that straight into the facility for projecting, as long as and I didn't bring the right connector. Okay, but so that's the important thing. But the HDMI, as Trevor mentioned earlier on, is really useful from that point of view. But this is associated with accessibility in all its ways and means that we can actually employ to get better learning to students, whether that happens to be in the field or in the laboratory or indeed at home. And I think that applicability of using something like this, where you can just carry it around, put it in your pocket or whatever, is a great advantage over using a laptop. You can do most of the things on here, especially if you've got decent eyesight, which may require putting those in. But on the other hand, if you can't get the connectivity, and I don't actually have a card on that, you can just link in through your iPhone. And it doesn't have to be expensive. That now is a Series 4, and it's about 4 or 5 years old, but works perfectly well for most purposes. But if you actually go onto the accessibility,
Plug in the headset again, please.
yeah, sorry, it's
Sounds coming.
yeah, the sound's coming through, right? If you go onto the accessibility, and I should have actually linked that in, but anyway, and you can find all sorts of useful things, so that the notebook, not notepad, which was once a bit kludgy, as supplied by Apple, all sorts of other things like using Sketch or Notepad or a variety of Moleskine different devices. You can use sound recognition for your own voice for making digital notes, and it works actually quite well. You have to train it for some things, but in fact the computing power on this is so much greater, and of course that's what voice recognition actually goes for. So that also applies to making notes. You can do that in the field, or students who are disabled from terms of writing. That is a good way of making notes. So there are all sorts of things just by scrolling through the applications on board the machine for accessibility, can give you all sorts of things which will not just enable students who have some sort of disability, but any student at any time, in particular working at the field. So taking field notes, linking this in maybe through a very microphone like this or whatever, using the magnification, and indeed, though it's a little bit redundant with the number of lenses that you can get on a upgraded iPhone nowadays, to be able to use the facilities of taking a photograph through a microscope, again on this enables all sorts of lab and field applicability for students making their own notes, not having to do anything else other than to take this around, whether or not it's linked into an iPhone. And of course, the great thing is that I can make a note on this, go home, and it's already uploaded on. So as soon as I come into my local Wi-Fi zone, it's uploaded, and then you can work down, and that works particularly well for field notes. So it's a transmissible device, translatable device, and it's a device that you can use as long as you know what its capabilities are and use it in an appropriate way. So it's not just a matter of, oh, it's an iPad, so what? But it's an iPad and it can do lots of things, often much easier than, say, a normal laptop can do. And it's usually a lot cheaper.
Shall I show a couple
Yep.
of examples?
Yeah.
Okay. How are we for time? Minute or so?
We've got 3 or 4 minutes left, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, that's it. So I've just got a couple of examples. I don't have a great deal more. I mean, clearly Brian has kind of, explained a lot of the mobile stuff and the way in which that's contributed to EFL and things like that. There was just a couple of thoughts. There's 2 applications that I have been using recently. One that I've only come across recently. Another one that I actually showed in the demo, this NDI camera thing. And I just thought I may as well point out some of those. So it's little apps that you can use often on your phone. The first one is to do audio streaming, and it works really well on Android phones. And it also works on people's computers. So on laptops, if you've got a Windows or a Linux or a Mac OS laptop, it can work on those. It can't work on the iOS phones for a few reasons, but it may come online to that very soon, apparently. So the explanation of this one, it's an audio app. I'm hoping, don't tell me, slice blank. That's not great.
It wasn't earlier.
Bugger. Would you mind if we stop sharing that and try it again? So I've got a couple of apps, and I had a slide that had the details on, so hopefully that'll appear in a moment. And the first one is called Audio Relay, and I'll explain the context for this because it kind of sounds a bit bonkers. All it is an application for streaming audio, and loads of people are using it for streaming audio around their house. Yeah. So they'll have some device that's one of these little, players. Oh, here we are. We've got them now. Brilliant. Oh, I'm sorry about that. There we are. That's perfect like that. So this is this first one. It's called Audio Relay. It works as it says there on Android phones, tablets, and PCs. Won't work on the Apple phone or the Apple tablets, the iPad, but it will work on Android phones and tablets and on the computers. The reason I mention this is I came across an example recently where we had too many buses in a field trip. Yeah. They were traveling long distances to field sites. There were really clever people in each bus that could give the local geology of the environment as they went through. Yeah, and they would talk to the people in the bus. Every day you had 50-50. Shit, which bus do I get into? Whose tour am I going to get today? And what am I going to miss? Right. So the folks there said, look, what we need is something that we can have a little, two-way conversation between the 2 buses as they're driving along. So Audio Relay is the answer. You just have a little Wi-Fi browser or a little local wireless network that you can switch on, and then this Audio Relay will let you relay the audio from one phone, and then any other device on the local network can listen into that call. Okay, so what you do is you run it on one phone with a headset, you give it to the clever person in one bus, and you run the same thing at the other end, with a clever person in the other bus. So then everybody in the bus can join this little Wi-Fi network, and they can choose which person's tour they're going to listen to that day. Now, the point with that is, hopefully, it makes the journey a little bit easier. It makes folks that are hard of hearing not have to ante up. They don't have to put their hand up. You can just keep it on. And because it's a little wireless thing, it's audio, it's really small data. So it's just easy to keep in the field. So that's a bit of a tip thing, because actually, for local wireless networks, which can just be a Wi-Fi router or even just a phone hotspot if you're close enough to each other, and that'll work really well. And actually, I think it's probably quite easy way to get into this audio streaming. Because for me, learning conversations to the audio stuff is most important. The next one, which I'll just finish on, I'm hoping, I think it might be you in control. Wonderful. Sorry, Captain, I didn't take control of that. Is this NDI HX little camera app that I mentioned? There's a couple of links in there. We were showing it earlier. I'm not going to bang on about it, but again, this one you can use on the Apple devices as well as the Android devices it uses on the phones and the tablets. So if you are using that, there's a couple of little links there, one for the app itself, and then the other one for a load of tools that you can use on your computer, so that if you are streaming a video file from a phone or any mobile device, you can view it on a computer using their NDI tools. And it's one called Studio something, which I'll come back to me in a little minute when I stop talking. There's a little app that you can use to view the video, and that's really nice because you can have it in the field on a laptop so that you can see people's mobile phone. And again, if you get into field sites that are inaccessible but not too far away, you can do it without too much kit. So we'll stop at that, yeah?
Okay.
All right, so there's just a couple of little suggestions. Hopefully there's a few questions from the session.
Brilliant, there are. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll pass to Julia if we've got some questions. But all three speakers, actually, Sonja, Vicky.
Super. So we've got questions for Trevor, but and some comments for Vicky. And I think people are just very impressed with what Sonja presented, but there's no questions straight for Sonja. We can take some questions from the floor too. But the comments for Vicky, Simon had commented that there were suggestions that as people are cutting costs with upcoming additional costs at field courses might be sort of on the chopping block at schools and things, and that was quite a concern. And Leslie noted that Vicky's talk really set the scene for what people can expect coming into HE, and that was really useful. Is that capturing what you were saying?
Yeah, I was kind of sort of saying that we make a lot of assumptions about. Sorry.
No, I can't remember.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just sort of saying that we do make a lot of assumptions about the previous experience. I think particularly for geography, there's a kind of assumption that all students have done residential field courses particularly, and they know what to expect. And did a little bit of research a couple of years ago around previous experience. It was actually about labs, but it was quite clear that we make assumptions that aren't true. And I think that was a really important point, was the impact of COVID is kind of just aggravating that, and we can't make the same assumptions. But the digital side of things can really help us here. So that's kind of what I was saying. Yeah.
Where could we find that paper, Leslie? Where might that be published?
You can find it when I have a look and post it in the chat. It is focused on labs, but it's about the sort of previous experience that geographers and things have. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Leslie. So, and there are two questions. We were running a little bit behind, so we might try and wrap up quite soon. But there were two questions for Trevor. The first was, what's the Samsung equivalent for voice to text?
Voice to text.
You were talking, or
On the audio thing. So if you've got a Samsung phone, that will hopefully, most of those Samsung phones use the Android operating system. So that one that I mentioned, Audio Relay, will work on that. That should work fine for you. Yeah. That's all right.
And what sort of kit do you use for the Wi-Fi relay when you were talking about the clever people on buses?
Oh, yeah, just, well, I use this little wireless router. So it's the same kind of kit that you've got at home. And actually, I've got noisy way of an odd bugger. Yeah, can't do that. There's a little wireless router. It's far too far away for you to see. It's just a home wireless router. And those are the things that I use. And you just plug a little 12-volt battery into them. And in fact, your timing's perfect, because I was just going to add a little thing to the message. Just paste it into the chat there. I hope it'll appear. A little link to the resources and stuff that I mentioned earlier with the bits and pieces. So the example of the wireless router that I use is in there, and the little batteries that I use to plug it in and power it in the field as well is in there as well. So if people are interested in that or want to give it a go, let us know and I can help kind of point your people.
Great. Do we have any questions from the floor?
If we're exhausted, right. We're nearly there.
All right. So I think I might hand back to Alice then. Thank you.
More of a comment. I always like the tech at the end, and it's always good to see what's coming. I suppose the consumer grade kit that we've got now is fantastic, and we don't really know what will be in the next big device in a couple of years. But chatting with Trevor outside, and I've said this to somebody else, we were talking about cameras and spec and understanding spec, and it's really difficult. So I bought one of the new iPads because I wanted to do the essentially the onboard LiDAR scanning, and it would have been a hell of a lot easier if I'd ponied up and actually got the cellular enabled, because that's the only one that comes with the GPS, and it isn't clear from any of the documentation unless you dig and dig and dig that GPS won't be on board, and it only works the way I want it if I hotspot it off my phone, and that hotspot continues to be present all the way through my data collection. And my life is more difficult. There's a lot more post-processing that I have to do, and fudge factor because I got the spec wrong. And the specs are often hidden because the specs are, how fast is it? How long does the battery last? How many pounds does it cost? Not how can you actually use it in a really weird use case scenario. So
I've got fun as well. Because any council like they've done that for years. Yeah.
So find an expert is the message, I suppose, and then pray that you get it right.
That's the thing when you try this stuff. There's stuff that works, do share because we all have changes all the time. Discussion.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of that session of talks. So thank you again to all of the speakers and to everybody for asking questions. We've reached a point in the programme where we're going to be moving more to do a discussion where we are going to facilitate online people chatting in breakout rooms and people in the room talking together. So I'm going to hand over to Leslie Batty from the University of Birmingham, who has got a plan of how we are going to facilitate this conversation. And it's partly about wrapping up and reflecting on what we've been talking about over the last couple of days, but it's also about thinking about what's next and where we may want to go with EFL for next year. So I'll pass over to you. Thank you, Leslie.
Somewhere else. Do I need to plug in? Or is it just...
that should do enough. You can clip it on if you like, but it's probably good enough.
Okay.
Just
All right, can everyone hear me? Simon, you're our check online. Vicky's got in there, thank you. Perfect. Okay, so what I wanted to do, what we kind of wanted to do was, as we know, it's the 12th EFL. So we thought, and we have had such a lot of change over the last 2 or 3 years, and I think it's kind of really sort of moved the whole fieldwork discussions on very much, and we've heard about the sustainability, which is definitely rising up the agenda. So we thought it would be a really good point for us to have a bit more of an in-depth kind of discussion about where we go from here. So what do we want the EFL to do, but also a bit more broadly about where we want to go with sort of field work and what we're doing as a kind of sector. So what I've done is just put together 2 kind of short discussion sessions that are going to allow you to have a bit of a conversation with some colleagues. And I've put together a couple of some questions to focus your minds a little bit. And I've also put together a couple of Padlets for you to share your thoughts. So we won't do the normal kind of reporting back, which always takes forever because no one can ever summarise anything in 1 minute. So I'm going to just leave it on the Padlets. So please do use that to report. And I will try and summarise a little bit at the end of each session. We've got an hour, a bit over an hour set aside, but we'll see how things go. Because I don't want to curtail conversations, but I'm sure everybody wants to get to their lunch. So without further ado, and hopefully Catherine is facilitating the online groups for me.
You need to take control, Leslie.
Oh, have I not taken control now?
Yeah.
Do I press sync to presenter?
Yeah. And then if you move the slides on, we're on slide 1 at the moment. Oh, there we go.
I've just assigned people, if you're online and in the room.
Is that done?
Okay.
Because otherwise there will be speakers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why? That's right, isn't it? Okay, sorry about that. Slight technical issue. What have I done now?
We need to post those questions we need to broadcast those to the breakout rooms.
Oh, have you done the breakout rooms already? Okay, so what do I do?
Name once the rooms are open, we should be able to listen.
Okay, so everybody in the room, this room,
Yeah.
there's a Padlet that Leslie set up. So from that should be live on your screen. So you should be able to click on that link that says Padlet there, and then you can open up a Padlet. And in the real world, we can all get into discussion groups. We don't have to be wait to be put into a breakout room. So I don't know if people want to talk on their tables, or if you guys that are in the two. Leslie, sorry, I'm doing your organising for you. She's thinking about something else. Get yourself into discussion group sizes, and we will talk about these topics that Leslie set up. The Padlet looks like that. And please add your thoughts